Hi, this is Introduction to Peace and Conflict Studies. Let's start today's lesson. Today we are going to discuss about intractable conflict. Throughout the course, as a reading material, we will be using a web-based knowledge base called Beyond Intractability. This website contains a number of useful information, and when you read text, you can click the hyperlink. This will allow you to learn related concepts. If you are interested in the field of peace and conflict studies, please visit this website. We will be using a text from this website, so you do not need to buy a textbook. Okay, before we start, let's discuss today's objective. According to the syllabus, we are basically going to learn two things, but in fact they are all interrelated. We will begin with the definition of conflict and social conflict. Then we argue a certain types of conflict will more likely to become protracted. And we call protracted conflict as intractable conflict. So by asking a questions, we try to outline the nature of intractability. While it is closely related, we also discuss the characteristics of intractable conflict. Before we engage in these endeavors, I would like to ask you to think about the relevance to you. In other words, why it is important for you to understand the intractable conflict. Why do you need to care about the intractable conflict? There is no right or wrong answers. If you are interested in international relations, you may be able to come up with the ideas why it is important for you. If you are interested in peace, and the conditions of peace or approach to peace, maybe understanding the nature of intractable conflict would help you to understand why sometimes it is so difficult to resolve conflict and to achieve peace. So let's take a moment and to consider why it is important for you to be able to understand the nature and the characteristics of intractable conflicts. In the field of peace and conflict studies, there are many definitions of conflict. In this class, we are going to deal with what we call social conflict, which is defined as a relationship in which at least one party believes it has incompatible goals with another. The key is incompatible goals. If you want to get one, the other party will not be able to get it. Can you think of an example of incompatible goals? The easiest and perhaps the most typical one would be territorial dispute. Conflicts do occur in domestic circumstances. But in domestic circumstances, when social conflict occurs, the parties are more likely to pursue their goals following the existing rules, using, for example, the court to settle their disputes. Under such circumstances, we can say that the parties are pursuing their incompatible goals, following the legitimate rules, using legal procedures. Can you think of an example of social conflict which is operated under agreed rules and regulations? Let's take sports, for example. While they are not social conflict, but players in a sport pursuing an incompatible goals. However, they compete each other under the set of rules. So in the case of football, for example, the players have to follow the rules and obey the judgment made by the referee. In the case of court dispute, the accused and accusing will have to obey the court decisions made by judges. In the field of peace and conflict studies, we believe these types of conflict are not going to be protracted. While it may take time to reach a final decisions, for example, bringing a case to domestic court, and if you're not satisfied, you have the rights to appeal to a higher court and until you reach a Supreme Court. But at the same time, after the decision has been made at the Supreme Court, whether you like it or not, the process will be terminated. In criminal cases, you also have a right to bring it to civil court. But the point is the parties concerned will obey the rules. That is why we don't call it as protracted conflict or intractable conflict. On the other hand, in intractable conflict, the parties are fighting over the legitimacy of the rules, or sometimes they do not agree with the legality of the procedures, in particular the procedures of settling their differences. Can you think of an example in which parties are fighting over the rules? The background photo is an image of terrorism. While I do not intend here to legitimize the act of terror as a means to resolve conflict, I just would like to highlight sometimes people called or labeled as terrorists will refer to certain types of violence because they feel that it is not legitimate to settle their differences in established mechanism. Many of the intractable conflict that I have observed, the parties feel that they are negotiating non-negotiable an existing framework, legal framework, political framework, economic framework, and social frameworks they believe are not functioning, at least for their advantage. Therefore, they have stood up to change the structures. Some group seeks independence from the existing state structures because they feel that their views, values, interests are not well respected and preserved in existing structure. Some groups seek revolution. For example, they believe that existing structures benefit only the capitalist, and those who believe that they were underdog or exploited by these capitalists, they seek to change the regime. Perhaps people under the dictatorship, the people who seek liberty, independence, freedoms, and justice may organize movement against dictatorship. These conflict, I would call it intractable conflict or an example of intractable conflict. Can you think of any example of intractable conflict that we face today or any intractable conflict that we see it on TVs and news? Perhaps one of the most typical cases of protracted or intractable conflict can be found in the Middle East, where Israeli and Palestinian relationship as well as Israeli and other Arab states relationship. We also have seen a struggle in Myanmar between the military regime against the people who seeks democracy. Now, I would like to share with you a definition of intractable conflict provided by the textbook. The textbook has identified 3 dimensions. I would argue that these 3 dimensions are closely intertwined. For example, let's ask why a conflict is so protracted. Because a number of attempts made by the parties as well as intermediaries has failed. Why they have failed? Because parties has referred to destructive behavior when they want to resolve this conflict. Because the parties have employed destructive measures when they are pursuing to achieve incompatible goals. Then why they have to refer to a destructive behavior? This is because the conflict has been protracted. They have found it impossible to resolve through negotiations or non-violent means. The text has also identified 4 reasons that makes conflict intractable. The third and fourth categories we have already touched upon. There are 2 new items in this definition, which are identities and grievances. Identities means identity of the parties concerned. The conflict involves in their core identities. Perhaps the conflict is over who they are. Therefore, most of the time, the intractable conflict can be found in the religious conflict as well as ethnic conflict, because under such a label of conflict or under such a type of conflict, people's identities are at the core. The second categories, which is grievances, can emerge from circumstances in which their human needs are not met or respected, or sometimes they feel that their fundamental needs are being threatened. Under such circumstances, the parties are more likely to refer to a destructive means to protect themselves from the external threat. The grievance also include the worldviews. The worldviews can be defined as the cultural perspectives, cultural norms, and cultural values. If you believe in certain religious values, for example, under the Islam, they have their own way of understanding how to treat men and women differently, or how women can behave in the society. Under such a context, if you bring a different ideologies or different value system that embraces the man and woman are equal, and therefore there should be no discrimination between the 2 sexes, it may causes a worldview clashes between different cultures. Grievances can also happen by the sense of injustice. Minorities, for example, can feel that their rights, needs, and their values are disrespected by a certain regime or by a certain constitutions or by certain rules and regulations. Under such circumstances, the people can nurture their grievances. In other words, intractable conflict, we are dealing with a conflict between different identity groups who has the historical grievances against each other, and they are pursuing incompatible goals with violent or destructive means. The other readings, titled Characteristics of Intractable Conflict, also identifies the characteristics of intractable conflicts. It listed 6 items. In terms of actors, they are talking about states or non-state actors who hold a sense of grievances, and they also have a strong desire to change or redress their grievances. So again, the keyword grievances are also included here. The second category is in terms of the duration. This also overlaps with the previous definition. The point is the protractedness of the conflict. That is the key features of the intractable conflict. Third point is the aspect of issues involved in conflict. They're talking about intangibility of the issues, such as identities that we have already discussed. It is very difficult to make any compromises on your own identity or your worldviews, important values, cultural norms, and even sovereignty. If the conflict is over these issues, it is more likely to turn into a protracted conflict. The fourth dimension is relationship. Under intractable conflict, the parties are more likely to be polarized, and they nurture the perception of hostilities toward each other. And this is also already discussed, but the parties are more likely to use destructive means to settle their differences. The fifth point is about geopolitics. The author argues that the intractable conflict are more likely to occur in so-called buffer states. The buffer state exists between the two major powers. For example, the Afghanistan has been a buffer state in the past between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. During the Cold War between the Soviet Union and United States. The Soviet Union was supporting the communist regime in Afghanistan, and they have invaded in Afghanistan in 1989, while the United States was supporting so-called Mujahideen who were fighting against the communist regime. Perhaps another protracted conflict we can find in South Asia is the Kashmir region between India and Pakistan, also including China. The Kashmir is a very strategic and resource-rich area surrounded by regional powers. Perhaps on this point of geopolitics, we are facing now an emergence of new era. We may see a severe competition of a hegemony between the United States and China, and the decline of US power and US influences has caused, or at least affected, the development of many regional conflicts. Can you think of any specific conflict that has emerged and turned into protracted conflict due to decline of US power and influence? I would say Syrian conflict, although the conflict itself has not been triggered by the US interventions or US withdrawal, but at the same time inability of the United States to intervene and to settle has made the conflict intractable. Perhaps another good example is the conflict in Crimea and Ukraine. Russia was able to forcefully take Crimea, and the NATO as well as the United States has not been able to prevent that from happening. While the war in Crimea lasted only for a month, we could also argue that the protracted nature of that conflict still continues to exist. The last point about the management. We have also discussed on this point previously. We have argued that a certain conflict becomes so protracted because the parties and intermediaries has failed to settle the differences. In other words, we can say that intractable conflict has resisted any efforts to resolve conflict or manage conflict. So they argue that in the protracted conflict or intractable conflict, you can identify a number of failed attempts of peacemaking. And we have identified the importance of identities of the parties, including ethnic identities, religious identities, and their fundamental values and beliefs, as well as we also underline the importance of grievances that each party has. In other words, if we want to resolve protracted or intractable conflict, we must understand the identity dynamism of the conflict, non-negotiable nature of the conflict, which involves fundamental identity of the parties, as well as we also take into consideration of their grievances. Grievances are emanated from the sense of frustration of their fundamental needs and values and interests. Okay, that's the end of today's lesson, and perhaps in the classroom we can discuss further why certain conflicts are more likely to become intractable conflict.